He had his arm around her waist the way men do when they want other people to notice. Not affection. Performance. Marcus Hale was standing at the arrivals terminal of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport on a Tuesday afternoon in October, one hand resting on the small of his new girlfriend's back, the other holding his phone up so his assistant could take a picture. He wanted the shot. He had told her specifically, "Good angle, get the bags in the background, make sure you can see the terminal signage." His girlfriend, a 29-year-old woman named Kayla who worked in marketing and had been seeing Marcus for 4 months, smiled on cue. She was used to this. Marcus documented everything. They were there to meet a business associate flying in from New York. But Marcus had suggested they arrive early, which Kayla had thought was considerate until she realized they were early because Marcus had seen on a flight tracking app that a particular private aircraft was scheduled to land at the same terminal around the same time. He hadn't told her whose plane it was. He had simply positioned them, himself, Kayla, his assistant, and 2 pieces of matching designer luggage they didn't actually need to bring, in the most visible spot in the arrivals hall and waited. When the doors from the private terminal corridor opened, Marcus straightened up. He said something to Kayla that made her laugh loudly, and he laughed too, and he made sure he was looking in exactly the right direction when the woman he had divorced 3 years earlier walked through those doors. Her name was Diane, and she was not alone. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, subscribe so you never miss our upcoming stories. To understand what Marcus Hale expected to see when those doors opened, you have to understand what Diane Hale had looked like the last time he'd seen her. 3 years earlier, on a Wednesday morning in a lawyer's office in Buckhead, Diane had sat across from Marcus and signed the documents that ended their 11-year marriage. She had been wearing a gray cardigan she'd had since before they were married. Her hair had needed a trim. She had dark circles under her eyes from weeks of not sleeping properly, and her hands had shaken slightly when she signed her name. Marcus had watched her hands shake and had felt something he later described to a friend as relief. He had given her the minimum the settlement required. The law said she was entitled to more. They had been married for 11 years. She had given up a promising career in interior design to support his commercial real estate business during the years it was growing. She had managed their household and their social calendar and the renovation of 3 separate properties while Marcus focused on building the portfolio that now made him wealthy. But Diane had been so depleted by the end of the marriage that she hadn't fought for what she deserved. Her attorney had told her she had grounds for significantly more. She had told her attorney she just wanted it to be over. She had walked out of that office with the equity from their shared condo, approximately $90,000 after fees, a car that was 4 years old, and a last name she eventually stopped using. Marcus had walked out with everything else. He had felt the relief for about 3 weeks. Then he had felt something closer to contempt. Not because Diane had done anything to earn it, but because contempt is easier to live with than guilt, and Marcus Hale had always been a practical man. He had moved on quickly. There had been several women in the 3 years since the divorce, each one younger than the last, each one showcased in the particular way Marcus showcased things he considered valuable. He had bought a penthouse in Midtown. He had expanded the real estate portfolio. He had become, by most visible measures, the success story he had always told himself he was becoming. And every so often he had wondered, in the private and unexamined way that certain men wonder about the women they've discarded, whether Diane had landed somewhere soft. He had not lost sleep over it, but he had wondered. The flight tracking app had told him she was on a Gulfstream G650. He had looked that up. It was not a charter. It was a privately owned aircraft valued at approximately $65 million. That information had not softened his plan. If anything, it had sharpened it. He had arranged himself and Kayla more carefully, made sure the lighting was good, and waited. What he expected to see was Diane looking up, seeing him, and feeling the specific pain of watching the life she'd lost from the outside. What he saw instead was something he had not prepared for at all. Diane came through the doors in a pale linen blazer, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere to be but exactly where she was going. Her hair was different, longer, and lighter than Marcus remembered. She was wearing sunglasses she didn't take off when she came inside. Behind her walked a man in his 60s, silver-haired, carrying a leather briefcase, and 2 young women with tablets who were clearly staff. 3 people were waiting for her on the other side of the corridor. One of them stepped forward immediately and handed her something. A folder or a phone. It was hard to tell from where Marcus was standing, and she took it without breaking stride. She hadn't seen him yet. He stepped slightly forward, into her line of sight, and said her name. Diane. She stopped. She looked at him. The sunglasses came off. Marcus smiled the way he had practiced smiling. Easy, confident, slightly amused. He pulled Kayla a half step closer. He said, "Small world." Diane looked at him for a moment, then at Kayla, then back at Marcus. She said, "Marcus." One word. Completely level. The way you'd say the name of someone you used to work with who you occasionally thought about but not often. The silver-haired man behind her had stopped too. He was watching Marcus with the particular attention of someone assessing a situation rather than participating in it. "Passing through?" Marcus asked. He kept his voice warm, casual. "Or are you in town for something?" "Business," Diane said. "What kind of business are you in these days?" He let just the smallest edge into the question. Just enough to remind her of where she'd been when he'd last seen her. Diane looked at him for another moment. Something moved across her face. Not hurt, not anger. Nothing that Marcus would have recognized as the emotions he was hoping for. It was more like the expression of someone deciding whether a conversation is worth having and concluding that it is not. "Have a good afternoon, Marcus," she said. She put her sunglasses back on and walked past him. The silver-haired man followed. The two staff women followed. The three people who had been waiting for her fell into step beside her, and within 30 seconds she had moved through the terminal and was gone. Marcus stood where he was. Kayla looked up at him. "Who was that?" "Nobody," he said. He picked up his phone and looked at it. "Let me check when the flight from New York gets in." He thought about it on the drive back to Midtown. He told himself he wasn't thinking about it, which is how people think about things they can't stop thinking about. The Gulf Stream, the staff, the man with the briefcase, the way she had said his name, not with pain, not with longing, not with any of the feelings he had expected, but with the complete absence of those feelings, which was somehow worse. He called his assistant that evening. "Find out what Diane Foster is doing," he said. He used her maiden name. She had gone back to it after the divorce. His assistant called him back the next morning. "She's based in Atlanta," the assistant said. "She's been here about 8 months. Before that she was in Portugal. Portugal. For 2 years. She came back in February." "What is she doing? What does she do?" A pause. "She's on the board of a foundation called the Caldwell Foster Foundation. And she owns a design firm. She relaunched her interior design practice about 18 months ago. It looks like it's doing well. Several high-profile commercial projects." "What's the Caldwell Foster Foundation?" Another pause, longer this time. "It was established by an estate," the assistant said. "A man named Robert Caldwell. He died about 2.5 years ago. He was based in Lisbon." Marcus waited. "He left his estate to Diane Foster," the assistant said. "His entire estate." Marcus said nothing for a moment. "How large?" "I couldn't find an exact figure, but the foundation has made charitable grants totaling about $40 million in the last 2 years. That's just the philanthropic arm." Marcus set the phone down on his desk and looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline. $40 million in grants. From the philanthropic arm alone. He picked the phone back up. Who was Robert Caldwell? Robert Caldwell had been 71 years old when he died. He had made his money in luxury hospitality, a small chain of boutique hotels in Portugal, Spain, and Morocco that catered to the kind of travelers who wanted beauty and privacy and were willing to pay serious money for both. He had never married. He had no children. His parents were long dead, and his only sibling, a younger brother, had predeceased him by 7 years. He had met Diane Foster at a design conference in Lisbon approximately 4 years before his death, which meant he had met her roughly 1 year after her divorce from Marcus. She had been there presenting a portfolio of residential work, looking, by her own later account, for clients who wanted something other than what Atlanta had been offering her. Robert Caldwell had approached her after her presentation and said that he was looking to redesign the interiors of his 3 flagship properties and that her work was exactly what he had in mind. She had taken the commission. She had spent the next 18 months traveling between his properties, working on the redesigns, building a professional relationship with a man who was intelligent and cultured and deeply interested in beautiful things. He had good taste. He asked good questions. He respected her work in the way that people who understand craft respect people who practice it well. They had become friends. Real ones. The kind built slowly, through long conversations over dinner in Lisbon and Marrakesh and the Algarve coast, through arguments about design principles and agreements about literature and a shared fondness for early mornings and strong coffee. When Robert's health began to decline, a cardiac condition that had been manageable and then, over the course of a year, became something else. Diane had stayed. Not because she'd planned to. Not because anyone had asked her to. She had stayed because he was her friend, and he was sick, and she did not leave people who needed her. That was simply who she was. She had been with him at the end. She had held his hand in a hospital room in Lisbon on a Thursday morning in November, and she had told him that everything was going to be all right, which was not true, but which was the right thing to say. 3 weeks after he died, his attorney had called her into an office in the Chiato district and told her what Robert had done. He had left her everything. Not a portion. Not a gift in recognition of their friendship. Everything, the hotels, the investment accounts, the property portfolio, the foundation he had established years earlier for arts and community organizations, and the directive to expand it and run it as she saw fit. Diane had sat in that attorney's office for a very long time without speaking. Then she had asked if she could have a few days to think. The attorney had told her there was nothing to think about. The will was unambiguous and had been in place for 2 years, updated and verified and thoroughly documented. Robert had known what he was doing, and he had done it with full awareness and complete intention. She had gone back to her apartment in Barro Alto and sat on the balcony looking at the city and tried to understand what had just happened to her. She had not been looking for this. She had not maneuvered for it. She had not been calculating the odds of a wealthy man's friendship turning into a legacy. She had been living her life, rebuilding it piece by piece, after the wreckage of her marriage, and this had arrived like weather. What Diane did in the year after Robert died said more about her than anything Marcus had ever understood about her during their 11 years together. She did not move into a bigger apartment immediately. She did not buy things. She hired an advisor she trusted, a woman who had managed philanthropic portfolios for 30 years, and she spent 6 months understanding what she had inherited before she spent a cent of it in any significant way. She learned the hotels. She met the staff. She sat with the general managers of each property and asked them what was working and what wasn't, and she listened more than she talked. She visited every community organization the foundation had been funding and asked the same questions. Then she made her own decisions about what to keep and what to change, and she made them calmly and without apology. She did expand the foundation significantly. She relaunched her design practice as a commercial firm, taking on large-scale projects that the pre-divorce version of her could never have accessed. She moved back to Atlanta in February because Atlanta was her home, and because she had a community there, and because she had decided that running from a place Marcus Hale lived in was not something she was willing to do any longer. She had not thought about Marcus Hale very much in the 3 years since the divorce. This was not a performance. She genuinely hadn't. She had been too busy rebuilding, and then too busy building something entirely new, to spend significant time thinking about a man she had loved who had turned out to be more interested in what she represented than who she was. She had not planned on running into him at the airport. She had not, in that moment, felt the satisfaction of a reversal. She had felt something more like mild surprise, followed by a clear-eyed assessment of who he still appeared to be. He had not changed. She had changed completely. The combination of those two facts was not something she needed to perform for him. It was simply true. She had walked past him and gone to her meeting and had not thought about the encounter again until that evening, when her friend and former colleague Patrice asked her how the day had gone. "Fine," Diane said. "I ran into Marcus at the airport." Patrice put down her wine glass. "And he had a new girlfriend with him. Young. She seemed nice." "What did he say?" "He asked what kind of business I was in these days." Diane said it with the faint amusement of someone describing a harmless absurdity. Patrice stared at her. "What did you say?" "I said business. Then I left." Patrice was quiet for a moment. Then she started laughing. "Diane, you walked off a private jet and told him you were in business and then walked away." "I didn't tell him anything about the jet. He saw it." "That's his problem," Diane said. She picked up her own glass. "What are we ordering?" Marcus, meanwhile, was having a harder time letting it go than he wanted to admit. He told himself he was merely curious. That any reasonable person would want to understand how a woman who had left his office 3 years ago with $90,000 and a 4-year-old car had arrived back in Atlanta on a Gulfstream with a staff. He told himself his interest was purely intellectual. What it actually was, if he had been capable of that level of honesty with himself, was the first sustained reckoning of his life with the possibility that he had made a serious miscalculation. He had built his entire understanding of the divorce on a single premise: that Diane had been the lesser partner, that she had benefited from their marriage more than she had contributed to it. That the settlement, while legally minimal, was morally fair, because he had been the one building things, and she had been the one along for the ride. He had told this story to himself and to others for 3 years. It had the advantage of being partly true, in the way that self-serving stories often contain enough truth to be livable. He had built the real estate business. He had made the deals. His name was on the portfolio. What the story left out was the support system that had made those years of building possible. The dinners he hadn't had to cook. The calls he hadn't had to make. The properties he hadn't had to furnish or stage. The social relationships he hadn't had to manage. The hundreds of small decisions that Diane had absorbed so he could focus on the larger ones. He had not thought of any of that as a contribution because he had not thought of it at all. It had simply been there, like weather, like infrastructure, present and functional and unremarkable until it was gone. He had noticed its absence in the first year after the divorce more than he had expected to. He had adapted, hired people, delegated more, become more efficient in the ways that money allows you to become efficient. He had not dwelled on it. But standing in his midtown penthouse at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, reading his assistant's notes about Robert Caldwell and the foundation and the hotels in Portugal and Spain and Morocco, Marcus Hale felt something unfamiliar moving around in the space behind his sternum. He did not have a word for it immediately. When the word came, he didn't like it. The word was small. He called Kayla that night. Not to talk about Diane, he wasn't going to make that mistake. But because he wanted company and she was available and she was uncomplicated in ways that Marcus had convinced himself were assets. Kayla came over. They watched something on television that Marcus paid no attention to. At some point she asked him if he was okay. "Fine," he said. "Long day." She nodded and leaned against him and didn't press, which he usually appreciated. Tonight it felt like something else. Not comfort. A kind of emptiness he couldn't account for. After she fell asleep, he sat at his desk and pulled up the Caldwell Foster Foundation's website. It was beautiful. Simple and precise, with photographs of the hotel properties and of community projects in Lisbon and Casablanca and now, apparently, Atlanta. There was a mission statement about preserving cultural architecture and supporting design education in underserved communities. There were grant announcements and project photos and the kind of institutional language that still managed to feel human. There was no photograph of Diane on the public-facing site. No biography. No profile. He searched her name separately. Found a profile in an Atlanta business publication from 6 months ago. A Q&A about the relaunch of her design firm. The interviewer had asked how she had gotten from where she was to where she was now, and Diane had given an answer that Marcus read 3 times. She had said, "I spent the first year after some significant personal changes just trying to be useful to someone else. I think that instinct to be useful is actually where most good work comes from. You stop performing and you start doing, and sometimes what you can do turns out to be more than you've been told." He closed the laptop. 2 weeks after the airport encounter, Marcus did something he had not done in years. He called Diane. He did not plan what he was going to say. This was unusual for him. Marcus planned most things. He called from his cell in the morning, sitting in his car in the parking garage of his office building. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Marcus." Same tone as the airport, unsurprised. "I wanted to call," he said, and then, because he hadn't planned further than that, he stopped. "Okay," Diane said. She waited. "I wanted to say I heard about what happened, the inheritance, and I wanted to say congratulations." A pause. "Thank you." "Robert Caldwell," Marcus said. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Diane said, simply, without elaboration. "How did you two?" He stopped. "Never mind. That's not my business." "No," Diane said. "It isn't." Another pause. Marcus said, "You looked well. At the airport." "I am well," Diane said. "I'm glad." He meant it. That surprised him. "I just wanted to say that." Diane was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted. Not warmer, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The voice of someone who has decided to be a little honest. "Why were you at that terminal, Marcus?" He didn't answer immediately. "The tracking app," he said. "I knew your flight was coming in. You positioned yourself." "Yes." Another silence. "Why?" Diane asked. It was a simple question. Marcus had the answer to it somewhere. He could feel it in the vicinity of the thing that had felt small 2 weeks ago in his apartment. "I wanted you to see that I was fine," he said. Diane made a sound, not quite a laugh. "I could see that you were fine from the papers. I've seen your name in the business section." I know you're successful, Marcus. That's not what I mean, he said. And then, because he was sitting alone in a parking garage and the call had already gone further than it had any business going, he said, I wanted to see that you weren't. Silence. I know, Diane said. I know that's what you wanted. I'm sorry, Marcus said. He had not used those words in a long time. They came out unevenly, like words in a language he had known once and mostly forgotten. Diane said, I appreciate that. Not, I forgive you. Not, it's okay. Just, I appreciate that. The acknowledgement of the words without the absolution he had not earned. I'm going to let you go, she said. Take care of yourself, Marcus. She ended the call. He sat in the parking garage for another 10 minutes before he went upstairs. What happened after that call is not a love story, and it's important to say that clearly. Diane did not take Marcus back. She did not want to. The version of herself who had needed Marcus Hale, needed his approval, needed his world, needed the sense of legitimacy that came from being partnered with a man who treated success like oxygen. That version of herself had not survived the marriage. She had learned, in the years since, that this was not a tragedy. It was the most useful thing the marriage had given her. She had built something real now, something that had her fingerprints on it rather than his. She was not going to exchange that for the complications of a man who had called her on a Tuesday morning because seeing her walk off a private jet had made him reconsider his whole story about who she was. She had her own story now. She didn't need his. But something did change after that call. Marcus, to his credit, did not follow it with a campaign. He did not pursue her. He sat with the discomfort of what had happened, the airport, the phone call, the conversation in the parking garage, and he made a decision that was, for him, genuinely unusual. He decided to look at the thing he had been not looking at. He hired a financial advisor he'd been putting off hiring. Not because he needed the money advice, his portfolio was solid, but because the advisor also specialized in helping clients think through what they were building toward, and Marcus had realized, sitting in that parking garage, that he had been building toward the appearance of success rather than its substance for longer than he could account for. He ended things with Kayla. He was honest about it in a way he hadn't always been with people he was ending things with. He told her that he had been using their relationship as a backdrop, and that she deserved better than that, and that it had nothing to do with who she was. She had looked at him for a long moment and then said, I know. And then, I'm actually kind of relieved you said it. That conversation had been more honest than most of the conversations Marcus had in a year. He thought about what Diane had said in that magazine interview. You stop performing and you start doing. He thought about the 11 years of their marriage and what he had spent most of those years doing. The deals, the portfolio, the accumulation, all of it real, all of it earned, and none of it connected to anything that felt like genuine purpose. He had been performing since he was 22 years old. He had confused the performance for the thing itself. He did not have a transformation. Transformations are fast, and what Marcus was doing was slow. He made small adjustments. He had conversations he had been avoiding. He called his brother in Memphis, whom he hadn't spoken to in 18 months over a business dispute that had been, when he looked at it honestly, mostly his fault. His brother picked up. They talked for 90 minutes. By the end, they were not brothers who had resolved everything, but they were brothers who were talking again. That felt like more than Marcus had expected. Diane, in the meantime, was doing what she had been doing since she came back to Atlanta. Building. The design firm took on a project she was particularly proud of, the restoration of a mid-century community center in a neighborhood called Vine City that had been neglected for 20 years. The foundation provided a grant. Diane's firm handled the design. She was on-site 3 mornings a week for the 8 months of construction, wearing steel-toed boots and a hard hat, walking the floor with the contractors and making decisions about light and proportion and the specific shade of green on the exterior walls that she had been thinking about for 3 months. She had always been good at this. What was different now was that she had the resources to do it at the scale it deserved, and the experience to know what mattered and what didn't. She hired a young designer straight out of Georgia Tech who reminded her of herself at 24. Technically sharp, emotionally intelligent, slightly afraid of taking up space. She gave the young woman her own projects to lead before the young woman thought she was ready. She told her that readiness is usually retrospective. You rarely feel ready before the thing that makes you ready. The young designer had looked at her and said, "How do you know that?" Diane had smiled. "I had a long education." The Vine City Community Center opened on a Saturday in April. The neighborhood turned out. There was music in the courtyard and food from 3 local vendors and children running through the new garden space that Diane had insisted on, even when the budget had pushed back, because she had grown up without green space in her neighborhood, and she knew what it meant to have it. Patrice came. Several of Diane's other friends came. Her mother came, which meant more to Diane than she could explain without getting emotional, so she didn't try. A reporter from an Atlanta architecture publication was there, taking photographs. She asked Diane if she could quote her about the project. Diane said yes. The reporter asked her what had made this project meaningful to her. Diane thought about it for a moment. She thought about the years in a marriage that had made her invisible. She thought about the attorney's office in Lisbon. She thought about Robert Caldwell and the particular gift of being seen clearly by someone who had nothing to gain from seeing you. She said, "I spent a long time being useful to other people's visions. I'm grateful for what I learned doing that. But this is mine. This is what I see when I close my eyes and think about what a neighborhood deserves. Getting to build the actual thing instead of just imagining it. That's not something I take for granted." The reporter wrote it down. The article ran the following Thursday. Diane's firm got 4 inquiries in the week after it published. Marcus read the article. He had set up a news alert for her name, not obsessively, just as a practical acknowledgement that she was someone worth following professionally, which she clearly was. He read the quote about other people's visions. He understood, without being told, that he was somewhere in that sentence. He did not call her again. He had said what he needed to say, and she had received it, and the relationship they had, which was to say no relationship or the memory of one, did not require further contact. What he did was write her a note. An actual note on paper, which he had not written to anyone in longer than he could remember. He wrote, "I read about the Vine City project. Congratulations, it's remarkable. I've been thinking about what I've been building and whether it has any of that in it. I don't have an answer yet. I just wanted you to know I'm asking the question. M." He mailed it to her office. She received it on a Tuesday and read it at her desk and held it for a moment. Then she put it in the drawer where she kept things she wanted to keep. She didn't write back. She didn't need to. The note said everything it needed to say, and her keeping it said everything that needed to be said in return. There is a specific kind of reckoning that comes for certain people in their 40s and 50s. Not a crisis exactly, not the dramatic version that gets described in magazine articles. Something quieter. It arrives when the version of yourself you've been performing for 2 decades starts to feel like a costume that no longer fits. When the measurements by which you've been judging success, money, status, the size of the portfolio, the youth of the person on your arm, stop adding up to anything that feels like enough. Marcus Hale had that reckoning late, and he had it in pieces rather than all at once. He would not have claimed, at any point in the 18 months that followed the airport encounter, that he had become a better man. He was working on it. The working on it was real, even if the result was still in progress. He made a significant donation to the Caldwell Foster Foundation's Atlanta Arts Education Initiative. He made it anonymously, and he did not tell anyone, which was unusual for a man who had spent most of his adult life ensuring people knew what he was worth. The donation was not penance. He was not naive enough to think that writing a check resolved anything. But it was a gesture in a direction he had not previously gestured, and he made it without expecting anything back, which was a kind of small discipline he was practicing. Diane did not know about the donation. The foundation's administrator reviewed contributions, and anonymous meant anonymous. She was in Marrakesh when it came through, overseeing the final renovations on one of the hotels, working with a local craftsman on a series of hand-cut tile installations that Robert had commissioned years before his death, and that Diane was committed to completing exactly as he had envisioned them. She worked long days in Marrakesh. She ate well. She slept better than she had slept during the last 3 years of her marriage, which was a fact that still surprised her sometimes when she thought about it. She called her mother every Sunday. She called Patrice every few days. She had dinner with the hotel staff on her last evening there, all of them around a long table in the courtyard, eating dishes that the kitchen manager had prepared, talking in a mix of French and Darija and English that Diane could only partially follow but thoroughly enjoyed. She had not known, when she met Robert Caldwell at a design conference in Lisbon, that her life was about to pivot toward something she couldn't have imagined. She had not known that a friendship built on genuine respect and shared sensibility could produce a legacy that would occupy the rest of her working life in the best possible way. She had known one thing in those early months after the divorce, when she had arrived in Lisbon with a portfolio and a determination to find clients who took her seriously. She had known that she was more than what her marriage had made of her. She had been right about that. She had always been right about that. The year turned. Atlanta moved into summer and then into fall. Marcus Hale's business continued to do well, and he continued, slowly and imperfectly, to ask the question he had written down on that note. He did not always like the answers. Diane Foster's firm won a regional design award in September. She attended the ceremony with Patrice and two of her young designers, including the woman from Georgia Tech who had led her first major project and had handled it beautifully. Standing at the podium with the award, Diane said something she had prepared but that also happened to be exactly what she meant. She said, "The best thing that ever happened to my career was starting over at 44. Not because starting over is easy, it isn't. But because when you build something the second time, you build it differently. You understand what you're doing and why. You stop confusing the building with the proving. And that changes everything about what you build." The room applauded. Her young designer, sitting at the table below the stage, was crying in the way people cry when something articulates exactly what they needed to hear. Diane smiled at her. She stepped back from the podium and carried the award to her table and set it down and picked up her glass. "To building things that matter," Patrice said. They drank. 3 years after the airport encounter, a younger colleague of Marcus's asked him, at a dinner, what the best piece of advice he'd ever received was. Marcus thought about it genuinely rather than reaching for the polished answer. He said, "I had an experience once that made me realize I'd spent a long time measuring my success by other people's diminishment. Meaning, I felt better about myself when I could compare favorably to someone who was doing worse. That's a trap, because it means your sense of yourself depends entirely on other people staying where you put them." His colleague asked him how he'd gotten out of it. "I didn't get out of it cleanly," Marcus said. "I'm still working on it. But the beginning of it was understanding that the person I was comparing myself to had quietly built something extraordinary. And the only reason I didn't see it coming is that I stopped looking at her like a person a long time before I stopped looking." The colleague nodded slowly. "Who was it?" he asked. Marcus smiled. "Someone who deserved better than she got. And knew it, even when she didn't." Diane Foster never knew about that dinner conversation, or the anonymous donation, or the note that Marcus had written to himself in the parking garage on the morning after the airport. She didn't need to. She was in her office on a Thursday afternoon, reviewing plans for a new project, a library renovation in a small county in North Carolina, of all places, that the foundation had partnered with a community organization to fund. The library's director had sent her photographs of the space. Good bones? Genuinely interesting architecture from the 1960s, terrible lighting and outdated shelving, and a reading room that had been allowed to become a storage space. Diane looked at the photographs for a long time. She could see it already. The reading room opened back up, the shelving replaced with something that invited rather than warehoused, the light coming in from the west windows in the late afternoon the way light in a good reading room should. She wrote a note back to the director with 3 questions and 2 preliminary ideas. Then she went to her window and looked at the Atlanta skyline and thought about the woman she had been, sitting in a lawyer's office in Buckhead in a gray cardigan with shaking hands, signing papers that ended one version of her life. She did not feel sorry for that woman. She had done the best she could with what she understood at the time, which is what most people do. She felt something closer to gratitude. For the years in Lisbon. For Robert's friendship and his impossible, life-changing gift. For Patrice. For her mother. For the young designer from Georgia Tech and the craftsman in Marrakesh and the children who had run through the garden at the Vine City Community Center on the opening day. For the strange mercy of beginning again at 44 and finding out who you actually are when no one is defining you. She was 51 now. She had, by any reasonable estimate, the better part of her career still ahead of her. She had resources and relationships and a reputation she had built herself, from nothing, in the years since her life had fallen apart. She had not planned any of this. She had simply kept going and kept being useful and kept showing up as the person she actually was. And the life that had found her as a result was larger and more interesting and more genuinely hers than anything she had imagined while she was busy trying to be what someone else needed her to be. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. What would you have done, if you had been Diane, walking through those airport doors and seeing him standing there with his arm around someone new? Would you have stopped? Would you have said more? Most of us would have felt something, the pull of old hurt, or the urge to make him understand what he was looking at. She didn't. She just walked past him and went to her meeting. Maybe that is the real lesson of the whole story. Not the reversal. Not the inheritance or the foundation or the award or the private jet. Those things are remarkable, but they are not the point. The point is the woman who walked through those doors knowing exactly who she was, with nothing to prove to a man who had underestimated her for 11 years. That kind of certainty is not something that money gives you. It is not something that an inheritance gives you. It is something you build, slowly, honestly, with your hands and your decisions and the quiet accumulation of days when you chose to keep going instead of staying stopped. Diane Foster built that. She built it in the years when no one was watching and the outcome was not yet clear. She built it in Lisbon and Marrakesh and Atlanta and all the spaces between. She built it one project and one honest choice at a time. And when Marcus Hale needed her to look diminished so he could feel large, she simply wasn't available for it. She had somewhere else to be, and she went there. Have you ever had a moment like that? Where someone expected to see you struggling and found something completely different? Share it in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.